Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello ma'am, my name is Yasmin and my student ID 2520085. Now I will give my presentation about contextual understanding. This chapter focuses on how the interpretation, choice of language, and the shaping of a text vary according to the context in which it is created and the context in which it will be used. When speaker and listener compose and comprehend spoken text, a range of factors influence their choice of language in the way they shape the text. These factors which are important for students to understand. 1. The purpose of the communication. 2. The subject matter. 3. The roles of those communicating and the relationship between them. 4. The situation surrounding the communication, for example, the physical setting and the formality of the occasion. 5. The social culture, belief and values of those participating in the communication. Next, about developing contextual understanding for speaking and listening. In order to develop communicative competence, students need to understand the way speaking and listening can be adjusted to meet the demands of a variety of contexts. They also need to be aware of the way in which spoken language can be manipulated for different purposes. Students learn that the purpose, audience, and situation affect the decision and choice that they make. This is known as the situational context. Students also need to know that socio-cultural beliefs, values, and assumptions affect those participating in a communication. This is known as the socio-cultural context. Next, about situational context. The decision that students make about their speaking and listening will vary according to the context. These decisions are influenced by the following. 1. The situation or setting in which the speaking and listening take place. Who speak at assembly, when to speak and when not to speak in the movie, when to speak and when not to speak when there are visitors at home. Number 2, the purpose of the speaking and listening, for example, taking someone, asking someone for help, discussing a book or delivering a lecture. Number 3, the roles and relationship between speakers and listeners, for example, family and friends, teacher, principal, sub-assistant, doctor, police officer. 4. The physical setting of the communication, for example, at home, classroom, sporting event, public library, restaurant. 5. The mode of the communication, for example, face-to-face with one person or several people, telephone conversation or inquiry, radio, or using a microphone with a large audience. Last 6, the topic being discussed. Next, about socio-cultural context. There are many socio-cultural factors that influence the composition and comprehension of spoken text. 1. The way that people use spoken language reflect and shape their view of the world. 2. The speaker and listener are strongly influenced by their gender, ethnic, and status. Then, spoken language is used to establish relationship and group identity. There are many different varieties of English around the world, including varieties of Standard English, Each variety reflects and shapes social cultural attitudes and assumptions. Next, spoken text can be crafted and manipulated to influence others. And then, what students need to know for students to speak and listen effectively for various purposes and audience, they need to be aware of the following. 1. Speakers and listeners make critical decisions when composing and comprehending spoken text. 2. Speakers adjust their speech as they identify with different groups. 3. Speakers and listener consideration of different points of view can confirm, broaden, or challenge an existing view. 4. The social and cultural background of language user will influence their speaking and listening choice. 5. Speakers consciously select and use linguistic devices to enhance impact or the influence particular audience. And spoken text can be investigated and analyzed to reveal their values and assumptions. Speaker and listener make critical decisions when composing and comprehending spoken text. Students need to learn how to vary the language they use according to the context they are in. This is known as changing register. Register is made up of 3 components. 1. Field. Who or what is being talked about, also known as the topic. 2. Tenor. The relationship between speaker and listener. 3. Mode. How the spoken text is being delivered. For example, face-to-face conversation, a telephone conversation, a formal presentation. 2. Speakers adjust their speech as they identify. Students need to develop speaking and listening repertoires that enable them to interact in different social, academic, and communicative settings with confidence. Students can learn about adjusting spoken language by analyzing the different speech communities they belong to and different speech networks they have performed. This will highlight the skill they already control and reveal the skill that need to be developed. In this way, students become a researcher of language. 1. Student as research of language. Students need opportunity to discuss how their knowledge, expression, and perspective influence their speaking and listening choice. And then next, making comparison. This way, students deconstruct spoken text, developing awareness of the structure and features that make up the text, as well as awareness of the social cultural implication of making such choice. Next, examining a speech from a family gathering. Family gatherings are easily accessible for students. For example, birthday party, anniversary party, engagement party. Being able to examine how speaking and listening adjustments are made in familiar contexts will support students when they begin to investigate speech adjustment in less familiar contexts. Next, investigating communication-based speaking and listening. Investigating speaking and listening in the community involves examining where and how speaking and listening are used. Hence, divide a text called a nested hierarchy that directs student attention to situations where thought can be categorized for examination. This activity is also known as a speech pyramid and can be used by students to gather data prior to a discussion. Example of speech: students will investigate a speech situation such as basketball game, then describe the speech event contained with it. For example, the coach talked before the game, the interaction before and during the game, encouragement from spectator, dialogue between players, the individual utterance that occur with a speech event are speech aids. For example, encouraging remakes, interaction between players. Number 3, speakers and listener consideration of different point of view and confirm, broad or challenge and exciting view. Speakers use language to represent their point of view. Listener can either accept or challenge the attitude, value, and belief that they hear. Students need to be aware of the way a point of view develops. This is for more explanation. Okay. Next, number 4. The social and cultural background of language use will influence their speaking and listening choice. A person's social and cultural background influence the choice they make when speaking and listening. Elements such as ethnicity, gender, age, education, and social class all contribute to the way that we use and interpret spoken texts. Depending on the speaking and listening context, this element can place people in a position of status and power, or cause them to be significantly disadvantaged. Next are interpreting gaps and silence. There are gaps and silence in spoken text. Listeners interpret these gaps differently based on their own social-cultural context. Next, assuming shared knowledge. Speakers may assume that listeners share the cultural knowledge and values. Teachers should involve students in collection stories about situations where shared cultural knowledge and values were assumed but which resulted in misunderstanding. Next, dominant values. The values of a dominant group or culture are often represented as the norm. Many of the structures in the society are taken for granted and can seem normal and acceptable unless they are questioned. 5. Speakers consciously select and use linguistic devices to enhance impact or to influence particular audience. There are many linguistic devices that speakers can use to enhance the message they are trying to communicate. Listeners interpret this device and decide how they will respond to the message. Encourage students to experiment with the use of linguistic device, have them examine how others use the device and reflect upon their effect. This is important that students develop awareness of the power of language to persuade, entertain, and inspire, as well as its power to isolate, denigrate, or marginalize people. The main linguistic devices used in plain and unplain speaking are listed below: allusion, analogy, anecdote, bribery, cant, choice of language, code switching, connotation, continuative, emphasis, figurative language, flattery, intonation, irony, jargon, propaganda, device, prosodic, feature, repetition, and simile. Number 6. Spoken text can be investigated and analyzed to reveal their values and assumptions. 1. Recognize that spoken texts are not neutral. 2. Recognize why in which people are positioned to show or acknowledge power. 3. Evaluate the belief and value that underpin spoken text. 4. Become aware that language is constructed and manipulated to influence or persuade. 5. Make informed decisions about their own views on specific topics. Provide spoken text for students to investigate to help them develop this understanding using some of the following ideas. 1. Provide recordings from the past. Using spoken text from the past highlight how language changed and how value and belief changed. 3. Point out how the language used might have appeared natural in particular socio-cultural contexts. Students could then move on examining contemporary spoken texts as the following: 1. Comparing and contrasting two reports on the same topic. 2. Listen to talk radio. 3. Listen to advertisement. 4. Listen to political broadcasts. 5. Listen to interviews. Next, embedding speaking and listening within the classroom. Teachers should provide a variety of purposeful context in the classroom, such as collaborative activity, plays, simulation, and presentation of learning. This activity allows students to develop their understanding of how spoken language varies according to the text. Next, focusing on contextual understanding in a unit of work. The inquiry process is an effective approach to use as learners focus on the topic while developing skill across several learning areas. Speaking and listening play an important role in the inquiry process, as shown in the Post Office Inquiry Unit of work planned by Rebecca Lyons, a teacher in a Western Australian suburban school. That's all for me. I think enough. I apologize if I have mistake. Thank you, ma'am. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.